again, that really depends on the setting. If there's no set amount. But that being said, if you're playing a game and it's set in the middle of a war, chances are you're gonna see a lot of combat because that kind of just goes with the storyline that's going on. If you're playing that is, you're in a world that's full of pacifists, I don't think you're gonna see much combat. But it should be whatever whatever it calls for, whatever the setting calls for. It's not. There does not have to be combat every session. Some might require more than others. Just it might be integral into the system or the setting. But beyond that, it's whatever the story calls for, whatever the game calls for.
I agree, 100%. It's all based on the setting you're in, the genre you're in, the realm you're in. Take a look at Game of Thrones. Who's the most interesting character? Tyrion Lannister. How much does he fight? Once in 3 seasons. So the social aspects are equally, if not more important, than the combat aspects of games. Oh, combat. There doesn't need to be any combat in a good session, to be honest with you. But, depending on your party makeup, you might have someone who seeks combat in every session. Even if you're not in the adventure, if they can't fight something, they're going to go to the bar and pick a fight with someone there so they can fight something, win, lose, or draw. They'll spend their night in jail. So, ultimately, there doesn't need to be any combat for a good session. If you've got good characters who are well developed in an interesting dynamic world, they could spend all night in town dealing with people, establishing trade connections, gathering information, But, at the same time, a lot of characters are developed for combat purposes, not so much social purposes. And does that mean they're not social characters? No. It just means that how they interact socially is a little bit different. Generally, players who develop these characters, I feel, develop better in combat. And that's how they, socially do interact with things, is through anger and rage and, punching, as opposed to diplomacy. So I don't think there needs to be any combat at all to make a good session. But at other times, if you're marching against an enemy town and there is no combat at all, it kind of seems mismatched. So here I think it's all about player expectation and what you as a Dungeon Master have kind of set up for your players, what you expect of them. And in that sense, your players get the expectations themselves. If they expect combat and you give them nothing, there's a chance your session falls short because they have lost their expectations. But in the same sense, if people are looking to build pirate ships, buy houses, start businesses, there doesn't need to be combat at all.
Yeah, see, again, I don't know if it's so much the players. Obviously, if you have players if you have a character, like, say, in a typical D&D setting, a stereotypical Tolkien-based D&D setting, if you have a character playing a surly drunken dwarf that likes to go around the bars and getting into fights, there's going to be some fights, and that is kind of dependent on the player. But, I think it's just more depending on the setting. If the setting calls for it, it's going to be there. If it doesn't call for it, it doesn't have to be there. Doesn't mean it won't be. I've ran games where we literally had meetings. My campaign meets once a week, and we played for a good 2 months before without a single round of combat. And it was every session was good sessions. None of it was wasted time. So it really just depends on the setting and what the setting requires. If the setting doesn't require combat, then you don't have to have combat. And that's why I said too. Sometimes the setting, not just the setting, but the system can dictate it too. I've played in systems where their combat is extremely lethal. Cthulhu. If you get into a combat scenario playing Call of Cthulhu, you screwed up. Ideally, you should never see combat if you're playing that game. Paranoia, oddly enough, is another one. Now, you might see lots of character death, But you really don't want to see combat and paranoia because that's going to end poorly. That's just the way that works out. And those so those systems, and now part of that is also their setting. So it's system and setting. I mean, you can play Cthulhu with mechanics of D&D. I mean, you can do it. Obviously, there's D20 versions of stuff out. That's essentially the same thing. So you can do it. In that case, it's more setting driven than mechanics. But sometimes the system itself will dictate it, especially if it has like a single proprietary setting. That's where that can get confusing. Some people, because there are systems that are set to a certain, they're fixed to a certain setting, whereas technically D&D mechanics now with D20 and stuff have been applied to a bunch of different settings. And then you have systems like Hero System, which again had a wide range of settings, and GURPS was the same way.